The airfield at Cockpit sat 30 miles behind the German front lines on November 7, 1943. It was a Luftwaffe base, occupied, guarded, and operational. That afternoon, a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt of the United States Army Air Forces rolled onto its grass runway, full of fuel, its guns still loaded, and its pilot completely lost. Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, based at Steeple Morden in Cambridgeshire, England, had flown south across the Channel that day on an escort mission to a target in northern France. Somewhere in the overcast, in the grey murk of a November afternoon over the Normandy coast, he had turned himself around 180 degrees without knowing it. He believed he was over southern England, approaching a friendly airfield. The hedgerows below him looked like hedgerows. The runway ahead looked like a runway. He set the aircraft down because the fuel state demanded it, and he was, as far as he knew, home. He was not. He stepped out of the cockpit and into the hands of a German ground crew who had been watching the American fighter on final approach with their mouths open. Roach spent the rest of the war at Stalag Luft I on the Baltic coast of Germany. His aircraft, Army Air Forces serial number 42-22490, nicknamed Beetle, and carrying the squadron code YF-U on the fuselage, sat intact and untouched on a Luftwaffe runway. The 850 caliber Browning machine guns were still armed. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine was still warm, ticking as it cooled in the November air. 3 days later, a priority message from the German command reached Erprobungsstelle Luftwaffe Rechlin on the Memoir in the state of Mecklenburg, roughly 300 miles to the northeast. There is a captured American Thunderbolt at Caen in good condition. Send someone to evaluate and ferry it. The man they sent was Hans-Werner Lerche. Lerche held the title of Hauptingenieur in the Luftwaffe's Engineer Corps. He was a Dipling, a qualified aeronautical engineer who had earned his technical degree through formal university training before the war put him in a cockpit. He had been at Rechlin since the late 1930s, recruited specifically because of his engineering credentials, and built into the establishment's principal test pilot for captured Allied machines as the war widened and the stream of enemy aircraft requiring systematic evaluation grew heavier. By November of '43, he had flown more than 125 different aircraft types. That number requires a moment's consideration. More than 125 types, in a decade of test flying, at an establishment whose daily business was evaluating machines that had not yet been proven safe or that had been taken from an enemy whose engineering decisions could not always be inferred from the outside. The combination that made him valuable to Rechlin was specific. A pure test pilot without engineering training could describe what an aircraft felt like to fly. An engineer who could also fly could describe what the aircraft was doing and why. Lerche could do both. This distinction matters when reading his account of the Thunderbolt's cockpit, because he did not simply record that the cockpit was complex. He identified the specific systems that produced the complexity and connected each one to its engineering function. His observations were the output of a trained mind, not an impression. Rechlin sat at the apex of the German military aviation intelligence structure. Everything captured in the field eventually moved toward it. The Wehrmacht's technical intelligence units were the first layer, securing intact aircraft and shipping them to a collection point. Rechlin was the second, conducting systematic evaluation and producing the technical intelligence reports that answered the questions the operational commands needed answered: service ceiling, diving speed limit, armament installation, fuel and oil system configurations, cockpit procedures, and their demands on the pilot. For captured Allied aircraft, those answers shaped how Jagdwaffe pilots trained to fight the new types and how German aircraft manufacturers designed countermeasures against them. His record across these evaluations was without accident or loss. If you value the actual archival record over the legend, the like button is what keeps this material in front of people who want the genuine testimony. Then back to the record. Erprobungsstelle Rechlin had been at the center of German military aviation testing since the 1920s. Its location on the southwestern shore of the Memoir in Mecklenburg gave it long runways, favorable approach paths over the lake, and access to the largely unpopulated airspace of the Mecklenburg Lake District, where high-altitude tests and terminal velocity dives could be conducted without overflying populated areas. The establishment tested every new Luftwaffe type from initial prototype through type acceptance and maintained standing programs for engine certification, armament evaluation, equipment testing, and the systematic study of foreign aircraft. The culture was measurement and documentation. Rechlin's credibility rested on the accuracy of its reports, and the foreign aircraft program that Lerche led had drawn on machines from every campaign since 1940. French fighters from the fall of France, Soviet types from the Eastern Front, Italian aircraft from the Mediterranean, British types from the Battle of Britain forward, American aircraft arriving in numbers from late 1942. Lerche had evaluated examples from all of these. His comparative framework spanned 3 years of systematic work, and it was the framework he brought to the Thunderbolt. He was not encountering his first American aircraft. He had already formed views about American manufacturing quality, American cockpit practice, and American power plant engineering. He was encountering a specific set of decisions made by engineers at Republic Aviation and Pratt & Whitney and General Electric, and he was placing those decisions against everything he had previously measured. He had evaluated British Spitfire variants, Hurricanes, Typhoons, American P-39 Aerocobras, operated by British and Soviet forces, a Soviet Petliakov Pe-2 bomber, French De Woitin D-520s and Morane Saulnier fighters captured in the 1940 campaign, Italian aircraft from the North African theatre, German experimental types that were still in development and flew at Rechlin because nowhere else in the Reich could properly evaluate them. He approached every new type the same way: walk the aircraft from outside before touching a control, study every panel systematically, build a written procedure for any system whose function could not be verified from inspection alone, and test that procedure at safe altitude before applying it in flight. He arrived on November 10. He walked across the apron to where Beetle sat under guard, climbed the wing route, and lowered himself into the cockpit. What he found in that cockpit stayed with him for 34 years. When he finally published the record of it, in Testpilot auf Beuteflugzeugen with Motorbach-Verlag in Stuttgart in 1977, he was writing from the flight logbooks he had maintained throughout the war, contemporaneous entries made on the days of the flights, not reconstructed from memory. Janes Publishing in London issued the English edition, Luftwaffe Test Pilot. Flying captured Allied aircraft of World War II in 1980. The P-47 chapter draws directly on those wartime records. His assessment was not the complaint of a man who found American engineering crude. It was the measured observation of a professional who had found a system built on assumptions entirely different from every aircraft he had ever evaluated. He wrote, "The P-47 cockpit could baffle even an experienced pilot." To understand why that sentence carries the weight it does from a man of Lerche's background, you need to know what he had measured against, and where German fighter cockpit philosophy had been heading in the years before November of 43. The Messerschmitt 109G, the standard Luftwaffe frontline fighter in November of 43, had a cockpit that was notoriously cramped and poor in rearward visibility, but its engine management had been progressively simplified. The DB605 engine in the G variant operated with a 2-stage mechanical supercharger, throttle and mixture controls, and a separate propeller pitch governor. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium had standardized instrument panel layouts across all German types, black-faced instruments with white needles, in defined positions that did not change from aircraft to aircraft. A Luftwaffe pilot changing types found the airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon, RPM gauge, and engine pressure instruments exactly where previous experience had taught him to look. The Focke-Wulf 190 had carried simplification further still. Its BMW 801 radial engine was coupled to the Kommando Gerät, a mechanical analog computer that automatically coordinated throttle position, propeller pitch, mixture ratio, supercharger boost setting, and cooling flap position from a single power lever. A Focke-Wulf pilot moved one control, and the device handled the rest. The workload reduction was substantial. Attention, freed from engine management, went to the combat environment, where it was actually needed. The Kommandogierate represented a particular design philosophy. Remove the complexity from the pilot, replace it with a mechanical system that makes the optimal decision automatically. The philosophy was that pilots under fire cannot reliably manage 5 interdependent variables simultaneously, and therefore the correct response was to reduce those 5 variables to 1. Republic Aviation and Pratt & Whitney had made the opposite choice. They gave the pilot direct authority over the R2800 systems, with gauges tracking each variable and dedicated controls for each adjustment. The philosophy was not that pilots could not handle complexity. It was that pilots who understood the system could extract performance from it that automation could not anticipate. Both philosophies were coherent. Both produced effective combat aircraft. They produced cockpits that could not have been more different, and the gap between them was the experience Lerche was documenting. A cockpit built on design assumptions that had no counterpart in anything Rechlin had previously evaluated. Republic Aviation's engineers had built to a different requirement, and the difference was rooted in the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was an 18-cylinder twin-row air-cooled radial, rated at 2,000 horsepower in normal operations. Military power ratings exceeded that. War emergency power ratings, used in short-duration emergency situations, exceeded the military limit further. It was the most powerful air-cooled piston engine in operational service anywhere in November of '43. It was also, by the accumulated evidence of wartime service, one of the most reliable. The Hellcat was proving this over the Pacific. The Corsair was proving it in the same theater. The Thunderbolt had been proving it since the spring of '43. The Double Wasp breathed through a General Electric C-23 turbosupercharger, mounted not in the engine cowling but behind the cockpit, low in the fuselage, fed by exhaust ducts running the full length of the aircraft from the engine to the turbine and back. The turbo was exhaust-driven, extracting energy from the exhaust stream that would otherwise leave as waste heat. At low altitude, this design added weight and complexity without decisive benefit. At high altitude, above 25,000 feet, where the thin atmosphere reduced the density of air entering a conventionally supercharged engine, the turbo maintained near sea-level charge density. The engine received the dense induction charge it needed to produce rated power regardless of altitude, and that was the engineering logic behind the aircraft's size. The entire lower rear fuselage of the Thunderbolt was in large part a housing for the exhaust ducting and intercooler assembly. This was why the aircraft had the deep, round belly that made it look, to European eyes accustomed to the slim silhouettes of the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt 109, almost implausibly large for a single-seat fighter. This was why it weighed more than 14,000 pounds fully loaded. This was why, when it appeared over France in the spring of '43, German pilots looked up at something that did not fit the visual category of a single-seat fighter at all. The cockpit above and forward of this assembly had to provide management access to every system that made it function. The turbo-supercharger wastegate controlled the proportion of exhaust gas directed through the turbine versus bypassed around it. The pilot managed the wastegate to hold manifold pressure within limits at a given throttle setting. Overboost at the wrong operating point meant detonation, cracked cylinder heads, destroyed exhaust valves. A separate tachometer on the panel monitored turbine RPM with its own overspeed warning light, because a turbine running beyond rated speed could destroy itself and damage the engine with it. The intercooler shutter controlled the temperature of the compressed induction air after it left the turbo. Compression heats air, and hot, dense air is less dense than cool, dense air, partially defeating the purpose of the compression. The intercooler extracted thermal energy from the charge. Too open and the charge was overcooled, risking carburetor icing at altitude. Too closed and the charge ran hot, raising detonation risk and losing power. The carburetor air temperature gauge monitored this variable. The pilot adjusted the shutter continuously, reading one gauge to manage the control that affected another gauge. At war emergency power, the pilot engaged the anti-detonation injection system, spraying a water and methanol mixture into the induction charge to suppress detonation at manifold pressures above the normal military limit. The ADI was a 5-minute resource. When the tank exhausted, the engine returned to its standard limit. The system had its own pressure indicator. The constant speed propeller was governed electrically through a separate RPM lever. Throttle and RPM were related but distinct tasks. During a combat power change, a pilot who applied throttle without adjusting pitch risked overspeeding the propeller or allowing it to lug, producing conditions that were operationally dangerous at the moment they appeared. The fuel system fed from multiple internal tanks, with individual gauges for each: left wing, right wing, main fuselage, auxiliary. Center of gravity shifted as the tanks depleted at different rates. The pilot managed selection on a schedule. Before entering combat, external drop tanks required jettison, a separate action. The 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns required gun heater switch activation before reaching altitude because unheated mechanisms froze at the temperatures of the upper atmosphere and failed to cycle. The arming switches for the electrical firing circuits were separate from the gun heaters. The hydraulic system powered the flaps, landing gear, wheel brakes, and cowl flaps, with its own pressure gauge and accumulator state indicator. Consider what that list meant when assembled into a single cockpit. The Messerschmitt 109G pilot managed throttle and RPM as his primary engine variables, with supercharger stage selection as a secondary. The Focke-Wulf 190 pilot managed one lever and let the Commander Gerrit handle the rest. Neither had a turbosupercharger tachometer to monitor, an intercooler shutter to adjust, an anti-detonation injection system to activate and time, or a multi-tank fuel system requiring active selection during combat maneuvering. The P-47 pilot had all of these, in addition to the standard workload of combat flying, and had been trained on each system individually through the American Type Conversion Program. He arrived at a combat assignment with the panel internalized through hundreds of hours. Lerche had arrived at it cold, on a captured aircraft at a foreign airfield, with no manual and the translation process still in progress. His task was to understand a cockpit whose American pilots had trained for months to master in the time it took to walk around the aircraft and study the panel. That he could do it at all was a testament to the depth of his engineering background. That even he found the system demanding enough to record it specifically in the memoir is the measure of what the cockpit required. Lerche was specific about the flap compensation system in the memoir, and the specificity matters. He was not recording a general impression of unfamiliarity. He was identifying the exact mechanism that had given him pause and explaining why it was not immediately self-evident. The flap system in a European fighter of the period was a straightforward hydraulic actuator. The same circuit drove both wing panels, both deployed to the same angle, and the pilot had no reason to think the two sides might behave differently under varying pressure. The P-47D's equalization mechanism meant that the hydraulic system was actively managing a discrepancy that European designs assumed would not exist. To a pilot who had never encountered this arrangement, the behavior of the flaps under partial deployment could be confusing precisely because it was working correctly. The P-47D's hydraulic flaps included an equalization mechanism that automatically corrected discrepancies in deployment angle between the left and right wing panels, maintaining symmetric deployment under varying hydraulic pressure conditions. European fighters of the period did not use this arrangement. The hydraulic circuit therefore behaved in ways that a pilot trained on German or British aircraft would not anticipate, and the documentation explaining the system was still being translated when Lerche arrived. He decided, before attempting takeoff, to test the flaps at a safe altitude first, operating them in incremental steps and observing each stage of deployment. This was the correct procedure for an unknown hydraulic system on a captured aircraft with no reference material. It was also a precise description of what the cockpit required. Patient, methodical investigation from the Luftwaffe's most experienced captured aircraft evaluator before he would commit to the aircraft. The instrument panel held approximately 30 separate gauges, warning lights, and indicators. Standard flight instruments were where a European pilot would look for them: airspeed, altimeter, artificial horizon, directional gyro, rate of climb, turn and bank. Everything else reflected American cockpit layout practice rather than the Luftwaffe's standardized configuration. Every switch, placard and label was in English. One feature Lerche recorded with evident professional respect: The Americans had marked engine limit ranges on the instrument faces in red and green color coding. Red for the prohibited range, green for normal operation. A pilot unfamiliar with the aircraft could read the engine limits at a glance from the instrument face itself, without consulting a separate document or having memorized the numbers from a type conversion course. German instruments of the same period used white needles on standardized black faces, readable and consistent across types, but without that immediate limit range legibility under stress. He found this specific enough to record in the memoir decades later. It was the kind of detail an engineer's mind retained, a human factors solution the American designers had found and his own service had not yet adopted. The cockpit Lerche described was this: gauges for 30 separate systems, English labels on every control, an unfamiliar hydraulic flap compensation system whose logic was not self-evident, turbosupercharger management with no German equivalent, and an engine management philosophy that gave the pilot direct authority over variables the commandergerate had automated away from German fighter pilots entirely. Not incomprehensible, not arbitrary, but layered in a way that rewarded systematic study and punished impatience, built on different design assumptions from anything Rechlin had previously evaluated. Now understand what November 7, 1943 meant in the wider air war, and why the German command treated Beetle as a priority intelligence requirement rather than a curiosity. The Thunderbolt had entered combat in the European theatre in March of 43, when the 4th Fighter Group at Debden flew the first P-47 operations over France. For the first months of service, its range was the binding constraint. Without external fuel tanks, the aircraft could escort the 8th Air Force's B-17 formations only to the German-Dutch border, approximately 200 miles from its English bases. Beyond that, the bombers flew on without fighter protection. The Luftwaffe's Western Front fighter defense had been organized with sophistication around this constraint. The German fighter control network, working from ground radar stations and the JAG Division command system, tracked the escort's turning point on every mission. The bulk of the Jahrgeschwader formations were positioned east of that point, where the bombers arrived unescorted and the interceptors could engage without the high-altitude Thunderbolts pressing them from above. The constraint began to loosen in late summer. On July 30, 8th Fighter Command Field Order 112 sent the Thunderbolt groups for the first time with 75-gallon external drop tanks. The escort radius extended to the Frisians and the approaches to the Ruhr. German controllers noted the new turning point and moved the concentration east. The Thunderbolt groups flying with the 75-gallon tanks could now accompany the bombers to the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland that the 8th Air Force's strategic planners had identified as a priority objective. The German interceptors that had been positioned east of the old escort limit had to be repositioned, and the positioning problem was becoming a calculation under permanent pressure. Wherever the P-47s turned back, the German fighter controllers concentrated their forces, and wherever the American engineers added more fuel capacity, that concentration point moved east again. The Thunderbolt had also been improving as a fighting aircraft through these months. The 56th Fighter Group, the unit whose pilots had most aggressively developed the aircraft's high-altitude diving tactics, was building a kill record that the German fighter leadership was tracking carefully. Colonel Hubert Zemke and his pilots had worked out through combat exactly the tactical solution that Lerche would later confirm from the cockpit: fight high, stay fast, dive when disadvantaged, and never let the aircraft be drawn into a turning engagement below 10,000 feet. German pilots who had not yet learned this were finding it out in encounters that were not survivable. On September 27, Field Order 147 introduced 108-gallon tanks, pushing the boundary into northwestern Germany. The American Air Museum's Mission Archive records the annotation from that field order: first use of the new 108-gallon drop tanks on the P-47. The German command recognized the trend. If each new tank pushed the escort further east, the conditions that had made deep penetration bombing survivable for the Luftwaffe were going to change. On October 14, 1943, came the second Schweinfurt mission. 291 B-17 Fortresses flew against the ball-bearing factories. The P-47 escort covered the first leg and turned back at its fuel limit. The bombers flew on unescorted for more than 300 miles across defended German territory. The Luftwaffe's waiting interceptors attacked in organized waves. 60 B-17s were lost. 594 American airmen were killed, captured, or wounded in a single afternoon. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration daylight operations. 3 weeks after Schweinfurt, a Thunderbolt sat intact on a German runway. The German command needed to understand the aircraft's true range capacity, its performance ceiling, its structural limits, what the exhaust turbo did to altitude performance. And the deeper question, was the 108-gallon tank the ceiling of the external fuel program, or was it an early point on a curve with more still ahead? The 8th Air Force's range extensions from March through September had been relentless. Each one had moved the threat east. Lerche's evaluation would answer what the current baseline was. What came next? The German command would have to watch the sky to find out. The specific intelligence requirements a captured P-47D could address were also these. What altitude gave the Thunderbolt its performance advantage, and how far did that advantage extend above the altitudes where German fighters were comfortable? What happened to the P-47's performance when forced down low, and how abruptly did that advantage reverse? How was the cockpit organized, and what did its complexity imply about the pilot workload the American training system was building to support? Lerche's evaluation would answer each with measured data rather than combat impression. He also recorded that before the evaluation could begin, a local Jagdgeschwader ace had heard about Beetle and insisted on being the one to fly it, despite having no authorization and no translated documentation. The dispute was resolved by compromise. Lerche would fly chase to verify engine serviceability first, and the ace would then ferry the aircraft from Caen to Pontoise, Cormeilles. The unnamed pilot flew the Thunderbolt successfully that afternoon, on the basis of what Lerche had told him about the gauges and what the American color-coded limit markings conveyed directly from the instrument faces. That a combat-experienced German fighter pilot argued hard enough to take the flight from the man the Reich had specifically sent to evaluate the aircraft says something that performance statistics cannot. The Jagdwaffe pilots who had been fighting the Thunderbolt since March of '43 wanted to understand it from inside the cockpit when the chance arose. They had learned it at cost from the outside. When one sat intact on a German runway, the cockpit was the remaining interior they had not yet occupied. The story of the ace and the argument illustrates the gap between what the German command formally knew about the Thunderbolt and what its front-line pilots wanted to know. The formal knowledge was in combat observation reports, in the tactical advisories the fighter leadership had distributed, in the preliminary technical assessments of downed aircraft. What the pilots wanted was knowledge of a different kind, the tactile, immediate knowledge that comes only from sitting in the cockpit and flying the machine. A pilot who had flown a Thunderbolt knew things about its handling, its visibility, its feel at the edges of the envelope that no intelligence report could convey. The ace at Caen was willing to argue with the Reich's authorized test pilot over who got first access because he was trying to acquire the only kind of knowledge his combat experience had not yet given him. Subscribe so the next document finds you. This channel works through the foreign record systematically. Subscribe and the next one comes to you. Lerche's evaluation in the weeks following the ferry confirmed and quantified what the cockpit study had indicated. At sea level, the P-47D reached approximately 500 km per hour, inferior to both the Messerschmitt 109G and the Focke-Wulf 190A8 at the same altitude. The aircraft was large and heavy, the turbo of no particular advantage near sea level, its frontal area producing drag that cost it in low-altitude speed comparisons with the German types. He concluded that the Thunderbolt was not suited for close-range turning combat or low-level attack. A P-47 pilot who let himself be drawn into a turning fight below 10,000 feet with a German interceptor was accepting an unfavorable engagement. At 9,000 meters, approximately 29,500 feet, the measurement was 640 kilometers per hour, roughly 400 miles per hour in level flight. At that altitude, the Focke-Wulf 190's BMW 801 was working at the ceiling of its mechanical supercharger and losing power rapidly above it. The Messerschmitt 109G's two-stage supercharger was more capable at altitude but still capped. The Thunderbolt's exhaust-driven turbo was designed for those heights and maintained power that neither German frontline type could match above 30,000 feet. In a sustained dive from altitude, the P-47D's weight converted to speed and the airframe absorbed loads that would have overstressed lighter designs. He concluded that the aircraft was excellent at altitude, in diving attacks, and at maximum boost. Not a dogfighter. A high-altitude platform that used its performance envelope correctly and disengaged in a dive when disadvantaged. The assessment aligned precisely with what American P-47 pilots had independently worked out in combat from the other side of the same problem. The engine, Lerche recorded, ran smoothly on every flight he made in both captured Thunderbolts. He had noted the same quality on every American aircraft he had evaluated at Rechlin. The R-2800 had been running through weeks of operational service before Roach set Beetle down at the airfield. It continued to run without incident through the evaluation. That reliability was not incidental to the cockpit's complexity. Every one of the gauges on that panel was monitoring equipment that actually worked. The performance data told the German command something it already suspected from combat, but had not been able to measure precisely. The Thunderbolt's advantage was not uniform. It was conditional on altitude, and the altitude above which that advantage became decisive corresponded closely to the altitude at which the 8th Air Force's heavy bomber formations flew their missions. This was not a coincidence. The P-47 had been designed for that altitude, and its turbo had been engineered to maintain power there. What this meant tactically was that the German defense of the Reich could not treat the Thunderbolt as a single threat profile. A P-47 escorting bombers at 25,000 feet over Germany was a different problem from a P-47 that had been forced down to 8,000 feet over France. The Luftwaffe pilots who had worked this out through combat by late 1943 had arrived at the same answer. Lerche's instruments would confirm. The engagement had to be forced to low altitude, or the P-47 had to be prevented from using its diving advantage when it chose to disengage. Neither of those conditions was easy to impose on a formation of fighters that had made its first appearance over your territory at altitude and on its own terms. The Rechlin evaluation translated that combat knowledge into measured parameters. It told the German command exactly where the performance crossover was, exactly what the speed differential was at altitude, and exactly what the diving speed limit was, above which the P-47's structural advantage over a pursuing German fighter became absolute. Lerche's measurement at altitude, 640 km per hour at 9,000 meters, established a number that the Jagdwaffe could build tactical doctrine around with precision rather than estimate. 500 km per hour at sea level established the other boundary with equal precision. The space between those two numbers was where the outcome of any engagement would be determined. The frontline Jagdwaffe tactical picture tracked the engineering measurement closely. Oberleutnant Hans Hartigs of Fighter Wing 2, whose conversations in British captivity at the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centre at Latimer House were secretly recorded and transcribed, left tactical advice preserved in the British National Archives WO-208 series. Draw the P-47 down to 3,000 metres by diving, then reverse suddenly. It will overshoot. If it tries to turn, it will slow and be vulnerable. But if it maintains altitude and uses its diving speed, it can engage and disengage at will, and a German fighter below it cannot close the range. By late 1943, the operational intelligence picture built from accumulated Jagdwaffe combat reports, the Rechlin evaluation data, and the POW transcripts at Latimer House had produced a reasonably complete tactical profile. The P-47 was not invulnerable. It had specific conditions under which it was dangerous, and specific conditions under which it could be managed. The German frontline pilots knew this from experience, and from the briefings their Geschwader commanders were distributing. What they had not possessed before Beetle arrived at the airfield was the measured interior view, what the instrument panel required from the pilot, how the engine management systems worked, what the turbosupercharger tachometer was monitoring, and what happened if that needle reached the red sector, where the structural limits sat. Lerche's evaluation provided that view for the first time from systematic technical analysis rather than inference from combat observation alone. Two independent lines of evidence. One, the engineer's systematic measurement from the cockpit up, the other the fighter pilot's tactical analysis from the combat record down, converging on the same picture from opposite directions. This is what the foreign witness record provides that no American account of the period could supply from the inside, the professional opposition's independent measurement, uninfluenced by the institutional pressures that shaped official American assessments. The second Thunderbolt that fell into German hands arrived under different circumstances. In May of 1944, during a ferry flight from North Africa to Italy, Second Lieutenant Lloyd P. Hathcock of the 301st Fighter Squadron, 332nd Fighter Group, became disoriented and flew the correct distance in the wrong direction. He set P-47D serial number 42-75971 down at Rome Littorio, a Luftwaffe-operated airfield. The aircraft had previously been flown by 8 Victory Ace George Novotny of the 317th Fighter Squadron, and it arrived intact. Coded T9-LK, it was assigned to Zirkus Rosarius, formerly the second Staffel of Versuchsverband Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe, the Luftwaffe's mobile captured aircraft evaluation and demonstration unit. Lerche evaluated this second aircraft as well. It was recaptured by American forces at Göttingen in May of 1945. Zirkus Rosarius toured frontline Jagdgeschwader bases with its collection of Allied types, giving German fighter pilots the opportunity to observe their handling characteristics, hear their engines, watch their flight behavior, and study their silhouettes from every angle before encountering them in combat. For many of those pilots, seeing a Thunderbolt at close range on the ground for the first time, reading the squadron markings still visible on the fuselage, walking around the deep belly and the massive engine cowl, was the first time the aircraft had been a concrete physical object rather than a silhouette at 3 o'clock high with tracer coming off it. The P-47 was among the most requested demonstrations because by May of '44, the aircraft had moved beyond escort work to ground attack missions at low altitude, hitting airfields and rail yards and road columns. German pilots encountering it in that role were meeting a different version of the aircraft Lerche had evaluated at Rechlin. Still the same engine and the same cockpit, but used in conditions that partially neutralized the high-altitude performance advantage and brought its durability under fire to the foreground. The R-2800 Double Wasp had been designed to absorb combat damage. It ran without oil pressure long enough to get a pilot home in conditions that would have stopped a liquid-cooled engine in minutes, because air-cooled radials did not catastrophically fail when a coolant line was cut. This quality translated in combat to an aircraft that came back from engagements that should have brought it down. The Zirkus Rosarius demonstrations were, in part, an attempt to make that durability tangible and legible to pilots who would have to decide when a P-47 was actually disabled rather than merely hit. The aircraft Roach had set down was a P-47D2RA, among the earlier production variants of the D model. Republic Aviation was already producing improved variants, and the 8th Air Force was receiving them at the rate that American wartime industrial production made possible. The external fuel tank program had pushed the escort radius from 0 to the German-Dutch border in 8 months of operational development. Further range extensions were in development. Whether the German command could determine from Lerche's evaluation how far that program was going to run was a different question, but the captured aircraft established what the baseline already was. What the cockpit also told Lerche was something about the industrial system that had built it. A panel carrying 30 instruments is a panel whose designers had confidence that they could manufacture 30 instruments, each to the required tolerance and reliability, for a combat aircraft intended to operate under sustained stress conditions at high altitude. The color-coded limit markings required gauge manufacturers producing consistent, legible markings that would hold up through the vibration of a running 18-cylinder radial. The hydraulic flap compensation system required hydraulic components machined to tolerances that would maintain consistent actuation pressure through the temperature extremes of high-altitude flight. The anti-detonation injection system required a water methanol tank, a pump, injector nozzles, a pressure indicator, and a delivery mechanism, all functioning reliably at the moment a pilot chose to call on maximum power. Every one of those systems had been tested, certified, installed, and shipped across the Atlantic in quantity sufficient to equip hundreds of operational aircraft by November of '43. The 8th Air Force was not flying one P-47D. It was flying hundreds of them from multiple bases across England, several times a week. The industrial scale behind that operational tempo was not visible in the cockpit at Caen the way that a gauge reading or a hydraulic response was visible, but it was implied by the aircraft's condition, combat-worn, 3 days after an emergency landing on a foreign runway, and still ready to fly. The engine ran without incident when Lerche started it. That single fact, recorded in the memoir alongside the instrument count and the unfamiliar flap compensation system and the English labels on every switch, is the quiet counterpart to everything the cockpit's complexity announced about American engineering ambition. The machine behind the panel had been built to the same standard as the panel itself. Lerche wrote about this quality consistently across the captured aircraft chapter of the memoir, not in the specific language of industrial comparison, but in the accumulated evidence of professional observation. The American engines ran smoothly. The American hydraulic systems functioned reliably. The American aircraft, when they arrived at Rechlin, were combat-worn machines that had been through weeks of operational service and still performed within their design specifications. This was the evidence of an industrial system operating at scale in a way that the German system, stretched across 2 major fronts and absorbing the attritional effects of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, was finding increasingly difficult to match. Lerche's memoir does not make this argument directly. He was a test pilot recording aircraft, not an economic historian analyzing industrial capacity. But the evidence accumulates across every chapter, and the P-47 chapter is part of that accumulation. The cockpit that required a professional of his background to stop and study it before flight was also the cockpit that worked reliably, whose instruments read true, whose systems functioned on a machine that had been flown by a disoriented pilot, set down on a foreign runway, and left sitting in the November cold for 3 days before the Reich's best man climbed in and started the engine. Rechlin's formal evaluation program for the P-47D unfolded over weeks after the initial ferry. The ground inspection phase documented the aircraft's systems in detail, working from the engine forward through the cockpit and outward through hydraulics, fuel, electrical, armament, and navigation equipment. Translated cockpit cards were prepared. A test program was constructed to evaluate the aircraft from sea level to service ceiling. The performance evaluation measured speed at multiple altitudes, rate of climb, service ceiling, and diving speed limit. The handling assessment covered stability and control through the full envelope, including stall behavior and the specific handling characteristics of the turbosupercharger system under varying conditions of altitude and power. The findings entered the formal Rechlin evaluation report and circulated through the Luftwaffe intelligence hierarchy from the operational commands to the Jagdgeschwader briefing rooms. Lerche's professional judgment, grounded in systematic measurement and documented in the logbooks he maintained throughout his career, was the technical foundation of every subsequent Luftwaffe assessment of the P-47D that drew on first-hand knowledge rather than combat observation alone. When Hartigs and his colleagues were giving tactical briefings about the Thunderbolt's strengths and how to exploit its weaknesses, the numbers behind their advice traced back in part to the evaluation at Rechlin and to the man who had sat in the cockpit and worked out what each instrument was for before he started the engine. The broader context of what November of '43 represented for the strategic air war belongs alongside the technical record Lerche produced. He could not have known when he sat in the cockpit that the escort problem was about to be solved by a different aircraft entirely. The North American P-51 Mustang, fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with a drop tank system that gave it range to Berlin and back, would begin operational escort missions with the 8th Air Force in December of '43, and by February of '44 it was escorting the bombers the full distance to the Reich's deepest targets. The conditions that had made Schweinfurt possible, that had required the Luftwaffe to position its interceptors east of the P-47's turning point, would be gone by the spring of '44. The Thunderbolt's role would change accordingly. As the P-51 took over the long-range escort mission, the P-47 groups transitioned to ground attack work, the role for which the aircraft's structural strength and its ability to absorb battle damage made it ideally suited. The same qualities Lerche had noted from the cockpit at Caen, the reliable engine, the robust hydraulic systems, the The structural integrity that permitted diving attacks at speeds that would have overstressed lighter designs made it one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of the European campaign in 1944 and 45. None of that was visible from the cockpit on November 10. What was visible was the panel, the labels, the unfamiliar system, and the color-coded gauges that told a pilot what the limits were even if he had never seen the aircraft before. There is a quality to the testimony in Lerche's memoir that distinguishes it from the body of post-war German military writing about the Second World War, most of which came from commanders explaining their decisions, defending their reputations, or accounting for defeats they had been party to. Lerche was none of these things. He was not a field commander. He was not explaining a defeat. He had no decisions to defend. He was an engineer who had spent the war testing aircraft and recording what he found, and he wrote the memoir because the record was worth having, not because it served any argument about the war's outcome or any man's place in its history. The memoir is therefore unencumbered in a way that much German military memoir is not. It does not need the cockpit to be worse than it was in order to justify a tactical failure, nor does it need it to be better than it was in order to demonstrate professional insight. It records what was there. The cockpit was complex, in specific ways that Lerche identified precisely. The engine was reliable, in a way he noted consistently across American aircraft. The high-altitude performance was superior to the German frontline fighters in measurable ways his instruments confirmed. The low-altitude performance was inferior in equally measurable ways. These were not conclusions that served a narrative. They were measurements. This is the character of the document, the German military's most experienced captured aircraft evaluator left behind. Not a verdict, not a legend, a record. If this material matters to you, a like helps it find the people who are looking for the genuine record over the mythology. Subscribe, and the next document arrives when it publishes. Hauptingenieur Hans-Werner Lerche, Chief Captured Aircraft Evaluator at Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, was born in 1914 and died in 1994. His original flight logbooks and personal papers are held at the Militärgeschichtliche Sammlung Lechfeld, the military history collection at Lechfeld Airfield in Bavaria. The memoir Testpilot auf Beuteflugzeugen was published by Motorbuch Verlag in Stuttgart in 1977. The English edition, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II, appeared from Jane's Publishing in London in 1980. Both are records of the same systematic career. More than 125 aircraft types across a decade of test flying, at an establishment whose reputation rested on the accuracy of its reports, without an accident or a loss from first flight to last. He evaluated the Allied opposition with the precision of a trained aeronautical engineer who understood that the measure of a professional was not in the aircraft he had flown before, but in the accuracy of what he could tell you about the one he had just climbed out of. He flew the machine. He measured it precisely. He wrote it down. Across more than 30 captured Allied types over 5 years, the standard never changed. Document what the aircraft is, not what you expected it to be. The P-47D was no exception. He climbed out of the P-47D at Cayenne on November 10, 1943, and wrote down what he had found. The full catalogue ran to several pages in the logbook. The summary ran to one sentence in the memoir. Both are primary documents. Both say the same thing. The men who saw America in war wrote what they saw in their own hands. This is one of those records, written from a logbook, 30 years before anyone outside Germany read it.